What's up, everybody? This is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, here to bring you another video with no frills, just the analysis. And today I'm going to be talking about what makes a character useless. But before I jump into that, let me just say for a second, obviously I haven't been putting out videos as consistent as I would like to. But I'm in the process of going through some things right now. School has just been swamping me, and now that The Walking Dead, the TV series that I was reviewing on a weekly basis, has now gone on hiatus, I'm gonna be able to do some things that I wasn't able to do before, and I'm also learning new things about myself and about what kind of YouTuber I want to be and what I want this channel to be about. So I'm just in the process of revamping some things, but videos should be coming on a consistent basis within the next 2 weeks. On a more consistent basis within the next 2 weeks. Okay, so this video is going to be about two things. The first is obviously is going to be about what makes a character useless. And it's also going to be somewhat of a video response to a lot of the sentiment that was expressed when Darius 19R put out that video about whether or not Yu Yu Hakusho was underrated. And when J-Man was talking about this, I forget what video he was talking about this in. He talked about how, Keiko was useless. And there were a lot of people who had comments that were, um, Keiko's a useless character. She's not, really worth anything in terms of the story. But so this is sort of a video response to that sentiment and why I disagree with Keiko with the idea that Keiko was a useless character. So in order to talk about, what makes a character useless, you obviously have to have some sort of understanding about what makes a character like useful. And this is true in terms of like, main characters, and also true of, secondary characters as well. Um, the most important thing for character development and characterization, as far as I can tell, is purpose. You have to give the character some sort of goal. You have to give them some sort of purpose, and you have to give them a way of, having a plan in order for them to achieve their goal or to fulfill their purpose. And this is especially true of shonen manga because it's action based and it's goal oriented by its very nature. Because you have to have a hero or at least a protagonist who has some goal and some purpose that they want to fulfill. And so they have to constantly be doing things that will allow them to achieve their goal or fulfill their purpose. And so it doesn't matter, how psychologically complex, how ethically complex your characters are. It doesn't matter how good your character development is. If they're sitting around not doing shit, or they're doing a whole bunch of stuff that is irrelevant to their goals or irrelevant to their purpose, the character is going to be basically shitty. It's going to be a useless character. It's going to be a very, ill-defined character. And Ziploc Gori also talked about this when he made his two-part kind of video series where he talked about, what makes a good protagonist and what makes a good antagonist. And he talked about how, the most important thing, the main thing in terms of building up a good protagonist is giving them a goal and giving them, some sort of purpose that they have to fulfill. And you can, clearly see how this plays out in terms of, like, for example, Naruto, when everybody's, always ragging on, Hinata and Tenten and Kiba and, that whole cast of, secondary characters because, for the most part, they get no character development and they're useless. They're, like hanging on Naruto's nuts and just hanging on, going along for the ride. And they basically have no goal and no purpose. Now, there are some sort of exceptions to this, although I can't think of any concrete examples off the top of my head. But take, for example, comic relief characters. Those characters, I guess even comic relief characters to some extent have a little bit of purpose, although their purpose is not, they don't have a purpose within the context of the overarching storyline. Sometimes they don't even have a purpose with regard to the advancement of the plot. So I guess they stand a little bit in between. They have a purpose, which is sort of comic relief, but in the grand scheme of things, they don't really have a purpose, any sort of, grand purpose. as it relates to the story or the plot. So that's one sort of exception, although I can't, in terms of shonen manga, I can't really think of any concrete examples off the top of my head. So to me, there are, three ways that a character, either a main character or a secondary character, can be useless. The first example is when a character doesn't have any purpose themselves, but they serve the purpose of a plot device. A plot device is just an object or a character that the author uses in order to advance the plot or advance the storyline. So there's some obstacle that the antagonist has come up against, and so the author will use this object or use this character to get the protagonist through this sort of obstacle in the plot or in the storyline itself. So this generally happens when a secondary character, although it can be a main character, aids the protagonist in some way. So if you think about King Kai, for example, and that whole thing about how Goku has to travel on Snake Way to get to King Kai so that he can be trained and then hurry up and come back so that he can be strong enough to protect the Earth from Piccolo and not Piccolo, sorry, from Vegeta and Nappa. After King Kai does that sort of training with Goku to make him strong enough to get through this sort of plot obstacle that is Vegeta and Nappa, King Kai is useless after that. I mean, King Kai is sort of like he's around, like he reappears in the Frieza arc, and I think he may also reappear in like the Buu saga and also the Cell saga, but for the most part, like just a useless character. Like he served his purpose as a plot device, and after that, he has no purpose, no goals. He doesn't really get any character development, and so he's basically useless at that point. Another character who like is in Yu Yu Hakusho, who I think is for the most part useless, is Botan. Like Botan, she acts as like the intermediary between like the human world and the spirit world, and she's a character whose like sole purpose is to sort of introduce Yusuke Urameshi into like being a spirit detective and introducing him to the spirit world into Koenma. And so, she's a sort of catalyst for introducing like what will be the main layout or the main formula of the series. But after that, she's pretty much useless. Like she doesn't like she does appear in the Saint Beast arc where she's like beating up like trying to save like Keiko from being, killed by like those people who had been infected by like that insect. But for the most part, she's useless. She doesn't serve any, she doesn't have any goals of her own. She doesn't have really any purpose of her own, at least not any important purpose besides being like, the intermediary between like human world and spirit world. And so she pretty much she has that, initial plot device purpose, but then after that she basically becomes useless. Um, Another good example of like a character who's like a plot device, but who's like for the most part useless is Chiyo from Naruto. A character, an arc specific character, who has just introduced like really quickly, and then she dies. She's sort of taken out also, really quickly. She has sort of like a dual purpose. Um, Although she like again like um within like the context of herself, like personally, she really doesn't have any goals. She doesn't really have like any purpose, like as it relates to the grand scheme of things in terms of like the grand storyline. But she does serve as a way to provide some sort of character development, some backstory and characterization for Sasori. And what really makes her important, for that one particular instance is she sacrifices her life to bring Gara back. After that, like, I mean, of course, after that, she's dead, but even if she had lived, she would have been like, basically a useless character. And besides, being used as a plot device to bring Gara back, she's basically useless. She doesn't really do anything except, help Sakura fight against Sasori, but she wasn't needed for that purpose. Like Kishimoto could have, had Sasori be defeated or be defeated in some other way. Like again, her only real purpose was to be used as a plot device to bring Gara back to life. Another way that a character can be useless is if they have no purpose or they have sort of a very ill-defined purpose. And this generally happens when characters are used as cannon fodder. Kishimoto's infamous, 40,000 ninjas have died in the first day of this Shinobi World War. Kind of picking on Kishimoto here, but people were obviously a little ticked off about that because that was basically some cannon fodder bullshit. Um, another instance where a character is sort of used as cannon fodder and they don't have any real purpose is Zero from Yu Yu Hakusho. A lot of people might not even remember Zero from Yu Yu Hakusho because he shows up in I think like maybe 2 or 3 episodes, and this is the guy in the first round of the Dark Tournament rather, um, that Hiei uses the Dragon of the Darkness flames on, and Zero sort of winds up as a black smudge on the barricade on the outside of the ring, or on the outside of the ring. So yeah, he's sort of cannon fodder basically. Another instance where a character can become useless is when they have a purpose, they fulfill that purpose. They're not just a plot device. There's actually some characterization, some character development to them. So they have a purpose, they fulfill that purpose, but then they become useless because they can no longer fulfill that purpose on a consistent basis. And the famous examples of this are people like Piccolo, Krillin, and Yamcha. So like at the beginning of DBZ, especially in the Raditz, where Piccolo was instrumental for helping Goku defeat Raditz, where he's also an instrumental Z fighter in helping to keep Nappa and Vegeta at bay until Goku returns. But also in terms of Piccolo's fight with Frieza, like Piccolo was a very useful character. Like his purpose was to be like a sort of member of the Z fighters, and to actually be useful in terms of fighting against the antagonists and against the villains. Once we get to the Cell Saga, Krillin, Yamcha, Piccolo, useless. They initially have a purpose of being a part of the Z Fighters, but um, once the antagonists become so insanely powerful, they basically become useless. And Krillin, gets sort of this side gig as winding up with Android. I can't remember which one it is, but he marries like Android 17 and 18, and so uh, he's supposed to at least be around, but we all know that he's basically useless. Um, so yeah, those are I think the three ways. Um, there may be other ways that I haven't thought about, but those are basically the main ways that characters can either be useless, or they're at first they're useful, they have some sort of goal or purpose, but then as the series or the story moves on, they become less and less useful until eventually they become useless. All right, so in order for me to like make an argument or to try and convince you guys that Keiko actually does have a purpose and that she has a consistent purpose throughout the entirety of the Yu Yu Hakusho storyline, I have to sort of give you some context about the relationship that not Kiko, that Keiko has with Yusuke Urameshi. So let me just do like a brief character analysis of Yusuke Urameshi. So, in terms of his backstory, Yusuke Urameshi was his father like abandoned him, so we never get to see who his father is, and his mother is basically an alcoholic who doesn't care for him properly, doesn't give him the emotional support and the love that he needs, and so Yusuke has like basically he has abandonment issues that sort of fuel this crisis of identity that he has. So when the manga initially starts, he's basically, some punk kid. He tries to, portray himself as a badass, but he's really, a failure, and he's sort of, given up on himself. At this point, as soon as the manga opens, we get a sense that he doesn't believe that he'll be successful at anything, that he's sort of given up on himself. And so Keiko is there, at least initially, she's there to sort of, um, to provide, emotional support for Yusuke, to sort of, try and convince him to have confidence in himself. But by this point, he's already internalized these abandonment issues, this sense of not being wanted by either his mother or his father. He sort of internalized that as self-hatred, and that initially is what leads to this sort of self-destructive behavior that he engages in. And as an extension, as a byproduct of that, as a result of that, basically, he becomes emotionally numb. He sort of puts on this bad guy persona or veneer to try and sort of convince people that he's a badass. When in reality, he's just using that persona to cover up his own internalized self hatred. And so, essentially, this is what the fight with Toguro was about. Like, Toguro isn't a monster because he became a demon. Like, Toguro is a monster because he's blocked his emotions. He's used the committee to make himself into a demon so that he doesn't have to grapple with his emotions, or to grapple with his feelings of guilt behind the fact that he was not able to protect his friends. If you know anything about Togoro's backstory, there was a demon who was trying to make Toguro fight him in the Dark Tournament, and in order to do so, he killed, all of Togoro's students and pupils at his dojo. And so what happens is Toguro uses the committee to make himself into a demon so that he doesn't have to deal with his emotions, so that he doesn't have to become a man and grapple with his emotions, his feelings of guilt. And so this was the sort of ideological struggle or the ideological clash between Genkai and Toguro. And part of what Genkai was trying to make Yusuke understand is that part of what it means to be a human is to have the ability to grapple with your emotions, to face your emotional problems head on like a man, to sort of take responsibility for your life in that way, and to also be able to establish emotional bonds and emotional relationships with other people. Because if you remember, Yusuke in his fight with Toguro, the only way that he was able to reach his full potential and to be able to reach his power was only after Toguro had pretended to kill Kuwabara. And this sort of leads to a sort of psychological transformation. And so, in this way, Yusuke is able to realize, he's able to understand that he can't be a child anymore, that he has to face his emotional problems head on. And what we get to see here is that this whole fight between Yusuke and Toguro and this ideological clash between Genkai and Toguro is an allegory. It's a symbol for Yusuke's transformation from a point of, internalized self-hatred and self-destructive behavior, and his transformation into a man who is able to take responsibility for his emotions and able to allow himself to establish emotional bonds and social relationships with the other people who are around him. And that's what that whole fight is about. Now, as we move to the towards the end of the Dark Tournament saga and the chapter Black Saga, we start to realize that Yusuke's identity um is basically tied to fighting, that his ability to establish bonds with other people and his ability to establish relationships with other people are basically forged through fighting. But however, at the end of the chapter Black Saga, he goes through um Yusuke goes through another phase of character development. So at the towards the end of the chapter Black Saga and towards, like, the saga of the Three Kings, the manga starts to become a lot more philosophical. And I think this is another part of the reason why it's underrated, is because people don't really recognize this transition from being just the action-based manga, shonen manga, to how it becomes more philosophical. And it becomes more philosophical because when Ryzen takes over his body after that whole, scene, Yusuke starts to think about his legacy, and he starts to think about his heritage, and he wants to know where he comes from, and he wants to be able to affirm his identity and to establish relationships and bonds with other people that are not merely tied to his ability to fight. And so this whole clash between him and Ryzen is just another symbol of how he's able to establish bonds with people. So if Genkai stands in as, his mother, like the mother that he never really had. Then Ryzen begins to stand in as his ancestral father, like the father figure that he never had. And so he's able to establish an identity that's not tied to fighting. And if you remember that scene between Keiko and Yusuke, where Yusuke goes to Keiko's ramen shop and he's talking to her and he's trying to explain to her why he has to go. He basically explains it by, he doesn't, say it in these words, but he basically explains it like, it's part of his own, like Ryzen is like his ancestral father and he's a part of his own personal history. And in order for Yusuke to be able to figure out, his own identity, he has to go there and he has to get his own, the history of his family and the history of where he came from. So, Yu Yu Hakusho, like a lot of people believe that, Yu Yu Hakusho is only about how Yusuke is a spirit detective, but it's not about that at all, especially as it begins to get towards the saga of the Three Kings. And you see this character development in Hiei because of the way he develops this sort of bond with Makoro, but you also see it in Yoko Karama in the sort of relationship that he develops with Yomi. And so the manga is not about how Yusuke is, solving these cases as a spirit detective. It's about how Yusuke learns to become a human, not become a human, but learns what it means to be a human and learns what it means to become a man by being able to take responsibility for the emotional problems that he has as a result of the abandonment issues that have caused him to engage in self-destructive behaviors because of his internalized self-hatred. Now, the reason why Keiko is so important is because she represents she becomes a symbol. She represents the possibility of Yusuke learning to love himself, but not just learning to love himself, but of his ability to let other people love him as well. Because remember, he uses that bad guy persona in order to basically lock people out or to push people away from himself. And so Keiko becomes a very important symbol of Yusuke's ability to, figure out who he is in terms of his identity, but also to be able to establish emotional bonds and social relationships with people that are not just tied to fighting. And so Keiko is very important in terms of being his love interest, in that respect. And a lot of people, will complain about the fact that, well, Keiko isn't, she doesn't really do anything. But again, like Keiko's purpose within the manga was never for her to be able to do anything in terms of plot, um, at all. Like she's not important in terms of plot, in terms of what actually happens in the manga, but she is very, very important in terms of this story of how Yusuke Urameshi learns to deal with his emotional problems. And it's okay that Keiko is not always present. It's okay that she doesn't appear basically at all in the saga of the Three Kings, because Yu Yu Hakusho is not a romance the way Rurouni Kenshin, for example, is a romance. And so there has to be this constant relationship between Kenshin Himura and Kaoru. And so Kaoru has to always be present in order to, have that theme of romance in the forefront of the reader's mind. Yu Yu Hakusho is different in that respect because it's not really a romance. And so I think it's okay that Keiko is, an important symbol of Yusuke's development, his transformation into a man who takes responsibility for his emotional problems. And so it's okay that, she's a symbol and she's not really, present. So basically what I think this boils down to is, if you only see Yu Yu Hakusho as the story of Yusuke Urameshi as a spirit detective and how he resolves all these cases that arise, then I think you'll miss the philosophical undertones of the ideological clash between Genkai and Toguro, and the fight between Yusuke and Toguro, and why that fight is so important in terms of Yusuke's characterization and his character development, and also how Keiko fits into Yusuke's character development and his characterization. So Basically, yeah. I think, Akira Toriyama was very important in the way he revolutionized manga in terms of, making it, action based and, an intergalactic battle royale. I know I've said that before, but Togashi Yoshihiro is, extremely important because of the character complexity that he brought to manga. And in a lot of ways, I think that Watsuki Nobuhiro was sort of, using, at least in some ways, using Yusuke Urameshi as a sort of template for how, character complexity should be revealed in a manga. When he developed, Kenshin Himura. Of course, Yusuke and Kenshin are not the same by far. But they are, they do bring a level of sophistication to character complexity that had not been there before they were introduced as characters. So again, this was my basically a sort of video response to people who were saying that Keiko was a useless character and that she wasn't very important. And so yeah, this is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga. Just brought you another video with no frills, just the analysis. Peace and have a blessed day.